The idea of women faking it has become one of the oldest jokes in television, but behind the punchline is a much bigger issue. Why are so many women leaving sex without feeling pleasure? Recently, I've been thinking a lot about orgasms, which is something I thought I'd never say, and not the euphoric joy of having orgasms, but rather the orgasm gap between heterosexual men and women, and the cultural and political implications of this, and how it reflects in our treatment of women in society. So, just very big topics. Well, in simpler terms, the orgasm gap is political and it shows in the way we treat women in our society. And this came across because of so many discussions recently that I've been having with my female friends in relation to sex and this idea of I thought we were all faking it. And there's many things I think we should fake it till you make it mindset. I just don't think orgasms are one of them. And how that reflects as well in our treatment of a women's society. And I think often when we think about the orgasm gap, I think we fail to recognize factors such as like in consideration of your female partner and how that in consideration of your female partner also reflects in society in consideration of just women in general, essentially, and how women are seen as secondary. And I really want to explore the dynamics in which the way we talk about male and female pleasure and this purity culture or this blasé we have around we shouldn't talk about this as women, essentially. When sexual health is important, we think of ourselves as very much more liberal than ever, but we are also having less sex than ever, which is not a bad thing, but it also means that we are sort of prudish in a sense in the way in which we discuss sex. And often at times, I think we prioritize male pleasure, and male pleasure is primary and prioritized, and female pleasure is secondary and just pushed aside, essentially, or even often at times demonized when you try and talk about the instance of which you want sex to be pleasurable as a woman, essentially. So huge topics, essentially. But a lot of this is inspired by a lot of my female friends who I've gotten permission to just discuss a bit of their experiences. Everything's anonymous. And it was just a really interesting topic, and it took a long while to like get around into like researching, editing, and then everything else has just been happening, essentially. But if you're new here, hi, I'm Sharon, and this is Sharon Unfiltered, where I explore media, fashion, politics, and everything in between. Gosh, it's honestly so good to be back though. I took like the longest, shortest hiatus ever, but life has been so busy and not even in a bad way. I've been traveling across Europe for the last couple of months essentially, and I've been able to record mostly, but then in the last month or so, I've been in France for a bit and like there was so much oble going on. Oble. Just think of that. Just think of Faji, think of Jai, think of enjoyment that I haven't been able to like do like any like work wise, and it was a great way to take my mind off of work because I finally got leave off my other job. And then I'd gotten this research intern role like a few months back and I knew I was going to start that soon, so I really wanted to make most of my summer before I was stuck in a 9 to 5, a glorified 9 to 5 for like a few months. And so with my research intern role, I've had to like move places. As you can see, new setup, I've had to move places, which has been like hectic, and then just doing stuff around work. And I'm in my third out of 4 years of uni at the moment, so I'm trying to just like decide my options between an MPhil or DPhil, so a master's or PhD in research, essentially. So it's been a lot of sort of thing, and then a lot of other work working in policy at the moment as well. So life has been busy, but I am so glad to sort of be back because this like channel was my baby, and like it's a really fun passion project in which I can explore things that I'm really just this is interesting to research or explore kind of thing, and I can just explore that freely on here. But it's so great to be back, and it's crazy how this topic ended up being a topic in which I wanted to start the great month of July with. But it was a combination of things in which my friends were talking about their experiences of orgasms, and one friend literally had an eye quote, I thought we were all faking it. And I was like, huh? What do you mean we're faking it? And this understanding of dynamic or why you felt the need to fake it to your male partner, and instead of having like, I guess sometimes honest communication. And it's easier said than done because in that moment you're like, I want to validate my partner's experience, and if you've experienced pleasure, that's enough for me. But then overall, in a long time, at least in consideration of your own pleasure, in which you're overcompensating for someone else's pleasure, but you're not enjoying the act at all. And sex becomes this thing that you sort of hate and it's painful, whereas it can be a really pleasurable thing. And that's not to like take away from people's experiences who don't completely enjoy sex or just don't want to have sex or have that feeling of arousal towards sex, which is completely understandable. But you want to have sex but then you feel like sex isn't, you get what I mean? So there's a lot of like discussions around like sex education and this British culture around sex as well. And then I was watching Sex and the City as well, and Samantha's like freeness around discussion around sex, and getting into my early 20s now and like being able to have these really honest and open discussions around sex with my female friends has also been something of great importance, which I think a lot of us were stripped in our childhoods as women, in the sense that you're not supposed to talk about sex, you're not supposed to be seen enjoying sex, and sex is not supposed to be this publicly enjoyable thing for sex. Whereas if you think about male discourse around sex and culture around sex, men are very much more allowed to speak about their pleasurable, what makes them go, what their kinks and ticks is. And I think if we were all like equally pushed towards men and women, I wouldn't really care. But I think the way in which we admonish women about, oh, I want to feel pleasurable, I want to enjoy sex, is crazy to society. So it was a mix of just a bit of everything. And now we're talking about orgasms, which I never thought I'd be doing. But yeah, we are talking about orgasms and the political and cultural implications of orgasms. So yeah. I really want to like start this video by defining some key terms, the first being orgasms. So I found this from a random definition of Google, very general, very blasé. But essentially, an orgasm is a sudden intense release of accumulated sexual excitement and tension. It's the peak, or what in British they call the pinnacle of sexual response, characterized by pleasurable sensations and involuntary muscle contractions. But yeah, orgasms are a sign of pleasure essentially, and pleasure, I think, is definitely a human need. It doesn't have to be through sexual means, but pleasure, I think, is a human need. We find pleasure in things we enjoy. I find pleasure in things like traveling and reading, and someone might find things pleasure in like music, so and so. Other people, a lot of people, we find pleasure in sex essentially. And I really want to talk about what the orgasm gap is. So the orgasm gap is disparity in orgasms between heterosexual men and heterosexual women. So it's mostly between heterosexual men and women. And the reason why I'm focusing more on this is because I'm a heterosexual woman. So I'm speaking on experiences that are close to me and close to the women around me, essentially. So in that instance, I'm not trying to be exclusionary, but I'm speaking on experiences that I know about and have heard about. So around 95% of heterosexual men usually orgasm during sex, and only 65% of heterosexual women do. So there's a huge gap already in that sense. And lesbian women also report significantly higher orgasm gaps than heterosexual women. And I think a reflection of that is in the sense of lesbian women are also women, so they know what can make a woman, what is pleasurable for another woman essentially, and what is the pinnacle of sexual pleasure for a woman essentially as well. So this immediately tells us that it's not a biological problem with the woman, but rather in the sense of how sex is essentially, how sex occurs, the process of sex occurs between heterosexual men and women essentially. And so if women can orgasm in other contexts, what's going on in heterosexual relationships that they're not orgasming, but also what does this say about us as a society that was so comfortable with the disparity between male and female pleasure? Something I was looking on for my starting point when I was researching this is our understanding of sex as a society. And I think the orgasm gap often stems from our understanding of sex as a society. And we often equate sex with penetration when it often isn't that. Obviously, for men, they penetrate, and through repeated penetration, they can orgasm and climax. But for women, sex is a lot more intimate and deeper. For both parties, it is intimate and deeper. But I do think for women, sex is not just penetration on its own. Penetration can be a part of sex, but sex is not penetration. And for a lot of women to orgasm, they need both a mixture of foreplay and clitoral stimulation, essentially, a mixture of those things for them to be pleasurable. But I think as a society, when we think about sex and we think of sex in this heterosexual and normative view in which penetration is sex, it really diminishes the experiences of women and other people who don't fit into that heterosexual category of sex, which means you're having a lot of people who don't find sex pleasurable and a lot of men who think sex is only pleasurable because they've only had great experiences of sex. But also in the sense that because a lot of men mostly have great experiences of sex, they can also easily express displeasure in which when they're not having a great experience with sex, whereas women are less likely to vocalize that displeasure essentially, because as a society we've made it that male pleasure is primary and prioritized, and women's pleasure is secondary in this instance. And this leads into like my next point in the way in which we view sex in society. But I also think we view sex as a performance. And often at times, I do think it's due to our overexposure of pornography as a generation as well, in the sense of pornography through pornographic means, so like videos of porn videos, but also pornography through like books as well and smut. And it gives us expectation of sex in which sometimes in real life is never delivered. And then that understanding of sex becomes this violent and this aggressive thing where sex can it can be that for people who enjoy that, but for a lot of people who don't enjoy aggression and violence, it's supposed to be a central moment. But when we have these misconceptions of sex, for instance, and these dystopian views of sex via pornography, it becomes very hard for a woman to experience pleasure in that, because pornography is mostly centered around it's all centered around male pleasure, to be honest, and male climax and orgasms essentially. And I think it becomes weird in a way that male pleasure is a measure of successful sex, and female pleasure is disregarded and secondary, that oh yeah, she could have kind of thing. And oftentimes it's even easier for men to be like, oh yeah, she hasn't orgasmed to what I've done in years, which is crazy because it means that you're being inconsiderate of your partner's sexual feelings, but she still has to participate in that script, that heterosexual script of sex essentially. And so we're kind of performing this act of sex as a performance. And I really like the time in which Goffman, who does the dramaturgical approach in sociology and criminology, talks about the way in which we perform on stage as a society. I think at times sex is also performance on stage in a sense, and the audience is often at times not just our partner for men, our partner like our, in a sense where she can kind of be giving you 0 stars, 2 stars, but also your male friends and said, oh yeah, I got laid, oh it was so good, this and that, and you're centering your own pleasure in that thing where it's like it was so amazing, but how did your partner feel? And we often at times neglect conversations around our partner's feelings as well. And I also think what's of importance as well is the way in which we discuss female pleasure. I think female pleasure for many centuries has been treated as suspicious, and we call women Jezebel or these really like quote unquote demonic connotations when they try and express that, oh, this is how sex should feel. And I feel like a really good instance of this is even recently, like Summer Walker in Girls Need Love Too, like she expresses, I forgot what the lyric is, but she essentially says that, oh, I don't want to have to vocalize in the sense that I want pleasure, but I do want pleasure. But if when I speak about pleasure, everyone looks at me this one way kind of thing. And that's just a reflection of contemporary society as well. And often at times I've had conversations where it's like, I think it's really important to talk about sex, and I've been blessed that I've had like friendship groups, and I have like a really close friendship group that we can talk about like, oh yeah, this was amazing, this wasn't amazing, but I feel like we'll do this or experience this next. It's very like very truthful, and I feel like 10 years ago we wouldn't have been able to have these honest discussions, even 5 years ago. But like emerging in our 20s, early mid 20s, it's become a thing where lots of us are in heterosexual or even same-sex relationships, and sex is something that we do and it's normal, and it's not this, oh, I don't want to be a prude kind of thing. And a really good example of this I think is in Bridgerton as well, where Penelope's younger sister is speaking to Penelope's mom, and she's like, oh, you guys have done the thing, right? She's like, where he inserts it, and she's like, insert it where? And obviously, ha, are funny, but ha are not funny where a lot of people, because of the British cultures they've thrown in, especially with purity culture and church culture, you don't have these really like just an understanding of sex and sex health, because it's that thing you never really speak about. And you get married and you're supposed to have sex and know how to do it, and you're traumatized because you don't know what you're doing or you don't know how it's supposed to feel. And then elder women in churches, and I've seen especially like Nigerian church dynamics, and where they have women group is like, just endure. And you have women in their 60s, 70s telling younger women in their marriages to endure. And she's like, will sex always be this painful? They're like, yes, because sex was painful for me. Whereas it could be a implication of an underlying issue, such as I don't know, underlying vaginal issues that, oh, maybe you need to get checked out, or maybe you should just speak to your partner in the sense that, oh, you might find this thing more pleasurable. But now the whole act of sex is scary and traumatizing, and I just have to do it to perform for my male partner, because male pleasure is pinnacle of this marriage essentially, to keep a man married to you, to keep a husband. And I think that's reflective again of cultural pressures around women to deliver sex on the table, like when your husband asks for sex, to deliver it essentially. And so you have this thing where you're not in the mood, but you have to do it because like it's your husband kind of thing. Said thing. You get what I mean? And I think this idea of purity culture really leads into well into sexual education, sexual health, and something I've been talking about with lots of women recently. And because I've recently just worked on I was working as an interview, like a panel interviewist on a panel on a domestic violence, intimate partner violence short film, and the importance of having discussions around like difficult discussions around intimate partner violence, but also just sex as well, and what healthy sex looks like. And I'm really glad that I had like a mom who just sat me down and talked about it. And it was the most awkward thing ever. She's like, Sean, do you understand what we're going to do? This is consensual. When a man and a woman or whoever you're with, when you and your partner want to do a thing, make sure you are ready. And sometimes readiness is marriage, but sometimes readiness is whenever you feel like you're ready. So, so that was a discussion, something like that. Mind you, I must have been like 16. I was cringing like this. Wait, was 16 or 15? One, two. But I was cringing like this. I said, but cringe conversations, but they're important to have. And I think something that's often common in cultures with extreme purity as well is this complete acknowledgement of sex and discussion of sex. So, and that doesn't just happen for women, because I think often at times we just think about, oh, yeah, a lot of women don't get discussion around sex. And every time this comes up, I think of that Bridgerton scene, both scenes in which Penelope's younger sister is like inserted where, but also in the scene of Bridgerton in the first season where Daphne is really angry at her mother, the fact that her brothers all know what to do with sex and she did not know what to do with sex on her wedding night. I was not taught nothing essentially. So it became this really uncomfortable experience essentially. And obviously she claims that later through the season sex becomes a pleasurable thing, luckily for her, but like for a lot of people it never becomes pleasurable essentially. And so you have in common the thing in common that women, both men and women, don't get talk about sex because everyone's preached around it. But you get married, you're supposed to have it, and people expect kids from you, and the kids come from sex. All we're told is you enjoy it. Same thing with men, and because they're not taught what healthy sex looks like, often at times you end up having this view of sex through pornography, which is often violent and aggressive. That I need to be violent for the sex to be good, kind of thing. Whereas sex should be mutually just enjoyable. And often at times in pornography as well, there'll be instances in which sex is very violent or just like sex is not carrying out the female partner, but the female actress will be still showing pleasure, like, oh, this is enjoyable, but she's an actress. That's what she does. She shows that male pleasure is important and her pleasure is secondary, so she'll just she enjoys it, but she doesn't really enjoy it. We all know she doesn't enjoy it, kind of thing. And so, a great anecdote for this, I really think, when I think about sex education, is like I don't know when this happens for other people, but in the UK around like year 5, you start getting having these conversations about sex education and periods, for instance, because that's when periods start popping up for some people and so on. And you'd be split by gender, so men in one, boys in one room, girls in another room. And we learned about periods as girls, but we also had to learn about flipping wet dreams. And we learned that boys dream and then they may release some stuff, but that's quite completely normal. But what was interesting to me as an adult is that boys never learned about periods when they did their own thing. They learned about wet dreams and they apparently had a lot of fun after that, because I have a good amount of male friends and I was just basically talking about this with both my male and female friends when I was investigating this topic of the orgasm gap. And what was interesting about this to me is that even when we think of just education from a primary format, it's centered around male pleasure and like male sexual experiences. And that, oh yeah, this is what you do as a woman, this is what you're going to experience as a woman, period and stuff. But also men have this thing called wet dreams. But men have learned anything about women's periods at times, which makes them quite intensive unless you have like sisters at home. Even with sisters, sometimes men are dickheads, but it makes them quite sensitive towards the female experience of periods. And I think something that's been really cool recently is that the idea of period stimulators, and they can feel how terrible cramps feel, and this idea of learning what periods are. So the list of discussion around like women and what me may experience, like discharge, for instance. Like we learn about male wet dreams, but men don't even learn what discharge is, and you don't even learn what discharge is. So you confused too. You think something wrong with you when like there's stain on your pan or something, where that's just a natural phenomenon of when your periods come in or a reflection of your cycle essentially, but you don't learn about any of the stuff because, like, again, sex education is centered around male pleasure and the male experience. But I think this pattern doesn't stop in just medication as well, but I think it also reflects itself in sexual health. And I really think it really explores itself in contraception as well, in the sense that women's well-being in contraception is a lower priority. And even recently, they're now coming out with like a male birth control pill. It's going to take like a few years for the rollout, but essentially it's proposed to have no side effects. Whereas women birth control has been out for decades, and sex shame and sex responsibility and sex reproduction has always fallen on the backs of women, on the shoulders of women, that you're responsible if you get pregnant, you're this, you're that. And women's bodies are governed around this. In fact, that abortion rights are around women's bodies essentially, and never around, oh, a man should be quote unquote castrated, which I don't think he should, but like it's never that discussion. It's always like, oh, women shouldn't do this, women should do that, and the pendulum is always falling on women's bodies essentially. And I think it's really interesting in that sense that they'll be able to have one without side effects, or women have had side effects for decades, including like neural issues, so on, extremely just painful cramps when you come off of birth control. But I also think other conditions like endometriosis, for instance, are under researched or underfunded because they do not affect men. But you'll see a random stupid study. Actually, I'll put like a screenshot of it. But you see a random stupid study where it's like, oh, what is the study of male pleasure on women in a period? Are men still attracted to women who also happen to be in a period? Why do we care about that? Why? It's not that important. Okay, it's not that important. It's really not that important. But we under research things that really affect from like endometriosis and PCOS. And so in that instance, even in research, I already knew research centers men, but even in like health wise, it continues centers men. And even what's really interesting about this in terms of research as well is something I've been learning a lot more, is sense of the exclusion of women who happen to be on their periods as well. So we take women out on their periods, women in certain stages, and so most research participants are still men because they're the standard, or what they're the control like participant, that oh, you're the normal one. But men go through similar hormonal changes throughout the months as well. So why the hell aren't we inclusive of women's experiences? And I think sometimes that's like a back hold in research, that we don't get to hear a lot about women's experiences because men are the control participant and women are seen as deviants in research, essentially. Women's bodies, women's hormones, women's experiences. And it means we really don't get to do that much to make women's experiences easier. And so when I think about this orgasm gap again, in sense of this gap between male pleasure and female pleasure, but I think the pleasure is not just pleasure alone, but even displeasure. Like this understanding that we're comfortable with women in displeasure, we're comfortable with women having PCOS, we're comfortable with women having these painful experiences, having to go home, use paracetamol. But if a man was going through this, it suddenly becomes this moral panic and moral epidemic, essentially. Whereas we should equally care about both men and women when it comes to sexual education and sexual health. I've also been doing a lot of extensive reading into sex, theories around sex and feminism, essentially. And I stumbled upon this really great book by Audre Lorde, which discusses the uses of erotic, essentially. So the erotic as power. And she explores this common misconception in which we think sex and erotica are the same thing, where they simply aren't. Whereas the erotic is the source of knowledge, power, and self-understanding. And to access the erotic, you must be in a state of pleasure, essentially. And obviously, you can achieve pleasure through sex. That's one means. So sex can be a part of erotica, but it is not erotica. But like I said earlier, you can experience pleasure through traveling, walking. Like sex does not have to be your pinnacle in which you experience pleasure. And a lot of people, they will never engage in sex, which is also perfectly fine and normal, essentially. Like it doesn't have to be the thing that makes you quote unquote normal, that I don't experience pleasure in that way. But what Lord was saying is that if women become disconnected from pleasure, they become easier to control. And so so in patriarchal societies, were encouraged to disconnect from pleasure, were shamed from pleasure, that, oh, as a woman, you're not supposed to experience pleasure, that pleasure is only reserved for men. And so in that instance, we disconnect from pleasure sources and we disconnect from power. And so become more palatable and easier to control in these patriarchal societies, which I think the book itself is great. It has very much a great exploration. I'm doing this in a more shorter, quicker terms in relation to this topic of orgasm gaps, but it's a great read. I think it's really extensive, and anyone who's interested in theories around sex, power, and feminism, essentially. And it really talks into the coercive control of rape culture as well, in the sense that this violent acts of rape, someone can derive pleasure not just from the acts of sex, and I don't think it's sex itself, but this act of inflicting violence on somebody else. And often at times we see that in pornography as well. This act of inflicting violence on someone else creates pleasure for somebody, which is uncomfortable and it's nuanced, essentially. But I think the orgasm gap in this instance also reflects a broad disconnection of women and their own desires, that we're told to be really quiet, the fact that, oh, you're not enjoying this thing. And we're told, and not just with sex, but other stuff in society, like, oh, I don't like this thing. But we're told to hush and keep quiet and disconnect from our pleasures. So of course, in the sense that we're never really in true control of what we actually like or think we like, and we're constantly being at service and palatable to men, essentially. And so it means there's this level in consideration towards women in society anyway, but also in this in consideration there's a level of control, because things are male centered and centered around men essentially as well. And I think Lord's connotations into sex, power, and the violence around it, as well as the difference between sex and erotica, leads really well into purity culture and the way in which we think of purity culture. So purity culture teaches women that their value lies in their sexual restraint and their abstinence from sex. And it's really interesting, this modern revamp of purity culture that is supposed to empower women to take power of their sexual means. And I do think on both sides we have like a flip in which people are extremely like purity, where it's like, oh, don't touch sex, don't talk about sex, don't do this, and other people are extremely sexual in the sense that, oh, sex is a form of liberation, but sex is still a performance in which you're pleasuring men often at times in sex of performance liberation. I like to think I'm in the middle between both essentially, but I think purity culture in this revamp is supposed to quote unquote empower women, but I think because it teaches women that their power in sexual restraint, it continues to objectify women as objects of sex, that the thing that is powerful about you, that you hold as like an ultimatum card in front of men, is sex essentially. And so when I think of beauty culture, I think it's heavily rooted in Christian and Abrahamic religion movements essentially. And virginity becomes this sort of moral currency in which people view you as, oh, you're a virgin? Oh, that's great. You're very much, virginity becomes this reflection of character. Whereas I've met the most horrendous people who happen to be virgins. Shit. And I've met, so it becomes this thing where it's like, because you're a virgin, you can do no wrong essentially, and you're pure and you're this nice person. But like I said, I've met the most horrendous people who also happen to be virgins, which is here or there kind of thing. And so the female sexuality becomes something to preserve rather than experience. I'm just reading from my notes at this point. And so in a sense, but in this flip sense as well, sexual shame also disproportionately falls onto women. So in these cases of extreme purity, so when the thing that is your form of moral currency and the thing that gives you value as a woman in purity societies like your virginity, when that is stripped from you, whether rather forcefully through rape or consensually, you're seen as less than. And even in situations of rape, you have this obvious instances of victim blaming, in the sense that, oh, but what were you wearing that day? And this is your fault. And now it's a reflection of your character. You bring shame on the family. So sexual shame falls upon the woman rather than the man that equally engaged in that sexual act or forcefully took a part of a woman that she may never get back in sense of sexual pleasure. And now sex becomes this extremely traumatizing thing for her essentially. And so women are objectified in the sense that they're told to not be sexual. So we can only see them as sexual beings and their worth is attached to sexual status. And men are rarely judged in, I think, equivalent ways essentially. And I do think men are judged on some levels and definitely some like purity societies as well, but not to the same extent as women, or sometimes they're not even judged at all essentially. And so we have this thing of which a woman's value is extremely tied to sex, her sexual status, extremely monitored, so her freedom is extremely stifled. So it starts with this idea of, oh, I just want you to be pure, I just want you to have power through yourself through sex, and becomes this thing in which you're not just objectified through the fact that the only thing you're good for is sex, but I now must continuously monitor you. And this is where the social, political, and cultural implications have come in. And a really good example of this is in Afghanistan, for instance, in which women are fully covered in blue burqas, for instance, but not just in the instance of, oh, because there's to be like heard, not seen, seen, not heard, or just not to be seen in general because they're fully covered, knowing their eyes can be seen. They can only leave the house with a relative, for instance. And this idea of that anything is something that provocates sexual arousal. So they're constantly surveillance because they're seen as only sexual beings, rather than comprehensive people. Which goes against what they're trying to prescribe to the other world, that, oh, we want this for women, that we want to see them more than sexual beings, and the way the West in which you can see everything, you can see her shoulders kind of thing, but you've objectified her to the point that she cannot leave the house while I'm a relative, and that you can purely only see her as sexual being. So that's why she's completely covered and she's completely monitored, because she needs to maintain her purity, and her purity is her status. And linking into this idea of female displeasure and the comfortability around female displeasure is this idea of pink tax. Pink tax is, this is my own definition, basically the economic disproportionality in sense of women pay more for products that are subpar and men pay less for products that are better essentially. And a really good depiction of this is, I'll stitch the video in this video as well, I'll put the video in, is a lady must have been in Boots, and Boots sells similar products for both men and women. And she got the male product, she got the female product, she does the ingredients, basically the same thing, but the female product like works less and costs more. The male product works better and costs less. And essentially, women's needs are sort of treated as opportunities for extraction and investment. And it's crazy that we pay more but we get less of what we pay. And what's crazy about this is that because economically, women are the best type of customers to have. Speak to anybody that does like, I don't know, content creation, for instance, or even like fandoms or just like business in general. Like when you think about women's product, women are really, really good customers. We are consistent. We buy better. We pay for subscriptions. We just invest better and stuff essentially economically. And it's crazy that the fact that you treat your best customers so terribly is crazy. But and not just terribly, but the products you're giving to them is subpar compared to a male product, for instance. So you're really just comfortable feeling displeasure, and there's never going to be that thing where it completely works. Whereas if it was for male products, I definitely think there's a higher standards, higher threshold in which the products are produced better, for instance. And so women are paying more whilst receiving lower quality. And so in this instance, women's bodies are simultaneously commercialized and also neglected. We're neglected in research, not just research, but also products. And because of terrible research, we have terrible products, and it becomes a circular concept. And it kind of links back into the orgasm gap in the sense that you don't really care how your female partner feels, but in society, we also don't really care how women feel. So we can treat them as subpar essentially. And to round this video sort of up, I really want to come back to the idea of female pleasure, in particular in terms of FGM, which is female genital mutilation. And FGM essentially is the deliberate act of some removal or full removal of external female genitalia, so places of sexual pleasure hubs essentially. So your clitoris, some removal of it or full removal of the clitoris, so you cannot essentially feel pleasure from sex, and it leads to really just painful periods essentially. And something that's really common in some African societies and some Asian societies, essentially. So that's like a brief explanation of it, but definitely there's definitely more in-depth explanations or books around this. I think everyone should, if you're interested in that, you should research it as well. But I think what was interesting in when I was thinking about genital mutilation is the reasoning behind it. I was watching some documentaries and reading some books around it, and a lot of the reason behind it is because it makes male pleasure quote unquote better. And I was shocked, yet interested in the sense that you cared so much about male pleasure, an adult man's pleasure, that you disfigured essentially your young daughter's genital area. And for lots of women, they don't know about this until they're at the age where they want to have sex, or they're at the age where they're having periods. And periods are extremely painful because you don't have a clit. And it becomes this extremely painful process where periods are already painful, but it's now worse. And it's worse because your parents prioritized a man's pleasure. A man that you have not met, they're going to marry one day in the future. That's if you date a man, over your own like pleasure and safety and said thing. And so it's supposed to reduce female pleasure essentially, or just cut it out completely. And so it's like it links back into purity culture of women are not supposed to experience sex. We're not allowed to publicly explicitly say that you want to experience pleasure during sex either. And so it ensures virginity, marital fidelity, and obedience essentially. And so female pleasure becomes this thing that's seen as dangerous and secondary and exclusionary essentially. And it was just really interesting in the sense of when I was thinking about the orgasm gap, it was something I was thinking about but I hadn't fully thought about in the links of sense of things like FGM, for instance, in which were essentially mutilating parts of young women's bodies for male pleasure. I thought it was just a bigger issue culturally as well, this cultural example of how we treat women, and that your bodies are these devices that are supposed to serve primarily male sexual pleasure essentially. And this is the important nuance around this is that a lot of many women with FGM, unless they have really good reconstruction surgeries or therapy or down there, essentially, are unable to orgasm essentially. So they've stripped their young daughters in the future of this, like, I guess, this decision or comprehensive choice in which when I have sex, or if I choose to have sex, I want sex to be pleasurable, you've been essentially stripped of that choice from a younger age in a decision you had no choice or no input in making, essentially. I just thought it was really important to really talk about that. And becomes a psychologically traumatic experience where anything sex, pubic area you become prude to it because it's traumatizing to talk about because you've been stripped of that experience from a young age. But it's just painful to talk about and it's painful to feel. You feel that monthly on a monthly basis because periods are extremely painful. when you experience FGM as well. So I think FGM sort of represents like the clearest example of society attempts to regulate female pleasure and just this priority of male pleasure, that for your husband, for your this, for your that. When does it end? When does it end? When does the treatment of women as secondary beings for male pleasure, male advancement, male this, male that? When does it end? That is the question I kind of was asking with this, and when I was thinking about the orgasm gap. So rather than thinking of the orgasm gap as one linked to orgasms, I think yes, orgasms are important, blah blah. But I don't think where I was going with this was the orgasm gap was kind of like an anecdote, or orgasms were sort of anecdote or reflection of our society and treatment of women. And sex is just one example in the sense where women are secondary. But this idea of sex bleeds completely into the treatment of women as a whole, essentially. And sex is just a powerful thing where we don't see sex as completely powerful. But I think when we think about instances of rape and discourse around FGM and this idea of pleasurable sex and non-pleasurable sex, then we start to see this thing as sex as control and power and the subjugation of women in society, essentially. But that was like my big research idea around it, and this idea that the orgasm gap is political. And when we start on something like that and we start to get a lot of nuance into this idea of why are you comfortable with female women talking about their what's it called pleasures and displeasures, then we start to have more honest conversations about what's wrong in society and how patriarchal our society is. But yeah, thank you for watching this video. Please like, share, subscribe. Please also comment what your thoughts are on this, if you agree or disagree, and if you have other like extensive like thoughts or like anything you feel like I've missed, or you feel like, oh, this is a Yuka moment, that this is something I didn't think about, but I think this is also important to mention videos like this kind of thing. But because I really love the way in which we can have really such open discussions in comment sections as well. And I think we just want to keep that going on. But yeah, thank you for watching, and your girl is back. Toodles.